Today I will be reading Folklore, Myths and Legends of Britain, a very good old Reader's Digest book. Windsor's Phantom Huntsman. Since the mighty bastions of Windsor have protected monarchs from their subjects from the time of the Norman conquest, it is not surprising that the ghosts within the castle are wholly royal. The quick, determined footsteps that hurry through the library are said to be those of Elizabeth I. By contrast, the steps in the cloisters are slow and halting. These may be echoes of Henry VIII, dragging his ulcerated leg for eternity. One visible manifestation is that of poor, demented George III, who, in his periodical bouts of madness, used to be shut into a room overlooking the parade ground. From there he would watch his soldiers drilling, and several modern sub-lanterns have been startled to see his face at the same window, called there apparently by the sound of marching and drilling men. Outside the castle, the ancient forest of Windsor Great Park is the province of Herne the Hunter, festooned with chains and with a stag's antlers growing from his brow. He is most often seen at times of national crisis near the site of the great oak that once grew in the park. He may also be aroused by impudence. It is said that his last appearance in 1962 was brought about by a group of youths who found a hunting horn in the forest one night and blew it at the edge of a clearing. They were immediately answered by a similar call and the baying of hounds. Then Herne himself appeared riding a black horse, his ragged antlers silhouetted against the sky. Terrified, the youths dropped the horn and fled. According to legend, Herne was a royal huntsman who saved a king's life by interposing his own body between a wounded stag and his master. As he lay there mortally wounded, a wizard appeared and told the king that the only way to save Herne's life was to cut off the stag's antlers and tie them to the huntsman's head. Herne recovered and for several years enjoyed the king's favour, but the other huntsmen, jealous of his influence, persuaded the king to dismiss him, and Herne went out and hanged himself. He has haunted Windsor Great Park ever since. The king's name is variously given as Henry VII, Henry VIII and Richard II, but in fact Herne was associated with the park long before kings came to Windsor. His stag's antlers almost certainly identified him as a Cernunnos, Celtic god of the underworld. Once he must have been worshipped in the park, and it would seem that he guards his ancient shrine still. Black Shuck, the demon dog. Uncanny black dogs are no stranger to East Anglia, for in a great storm in 1577, the same one in which the devil is thought to have left his mark in Blythburgh Church, a black demon dog, or the devil in such a likeness, appeared in Bungay Church and brought havoc with him. According to an old pamphlet, he departed leaving 2 dead worshippers strangled at their prayers, and another as shrunken as a piece of leather scorched in a hot fire. Demon dogs have haunted different parts of England, and particularly East Anglia, for over 1,000 years. In the eastern counties, the spectral hound is generally known as Black Shuck or Old Shuck, the term Shuck coming from Skuka, the Anglo-Saxon for demon. In the graveyard, unlike dogs of this world, Black Shuck seems more attached to places than to people. He has always walked alone, lopping along riverbanks and lonely roads, or leaping over churchyard walls and vanishing among the tombstones. The appearance and characteristics of Black Shuck vary from place to place. He seems to emerge from his secret lair only at dusk, and is usually described as a shaggy creature the size of a calf, easily recognisable by his saucer-sized eyes, or sometimes eye, weeping green or red fire, part monk, part hound. In Suffolk, Black Shuck is believed to be fairly harmless if left alone, but when challenged he has been known to strike his aggressor, senseless, and death usually follows, at Clopton Hall, Stowmarket, where he guards a hoard of gold. His appearance is especially frightening, for he has the body of a monk and the head of a hound. Often in Suffolk, he can only be detected by the touch of his rough coat as it passes. The Norfolk Shuck is a more sinister hound, more akin to the diabolical werewolves which haunted this sparsely populated region in the Middle Ages. He is an awful creature, as black as ebony, whose fiendish howls have been heard above the shrieks of the wildest gales. Terrified people have sensed Black Shuck padding behind them and felt his icy breath upon the back of their necks. Even today, motorists have reported swerving to avoid the hellhound crossing the road. There is a popular belief in Norfolk that no one can set eyes on Black Shuck and live. In East Anglia generally, when anyone was dying, people used to say, "The black dog is at his heels." In Essex, Shuck, however, is a kindly hound and has been known to protect travellers on lonely roads. Only his habit of haunting the sites of ancient gallows and graveyards is evident that he is a demon dog. A death warning. The Cambridgeshire Shuck, like his Norfolk counterpart, is both diabolical and sinister. He is sometimes seen between Wicken and the marshes of Spinney Abbey. Those who encounter him should look the other way, since his appearance is said to warn of death in the family. The most haunted house in England. A tumble of red bricks breaking through the glassy floor of an orchard, an overgrown path is still called the Nun's Walk. These are all that remains of the building that was once called the most haunted house in England. But whether the destruction of the Botley Rectory has brought peace to the Essex village, no one is yet prepared to say. The sad-faced nun, who was apparently at the root of the trouble, wandered over the site long before the rectory was built, and some people believe that she walks there still. Until 1863, the nun, Mary Lair, was a fairly conventional phantom. One story was that she had been walled up alive for the illicit affair with a burly monk. Another that she was strangled by a member of the Waldegrave family, a 16th century lord of the manor. Whatever the reason, she walked the village roads often accompanied by a spectral coach drawn by headless horses. Then, in 1863, the rector, the Reverend H.D. Bull, built a new rectory to house his large family, more or less athwart the course of the nun's nightly wanderings. The coach in the dining room. She seemed to have objected almost from the start. Whenever the rector sat down to write a sermon, Marie would gaze mournfully at him through the window. He was a strong-minded man, however, and apart from having the window bricked up, he entirely ignored the affair. Mr. Bull was succeeded by his son, the Reverend Harry Bull, who held the incumbency until 1927. Harry Bull had leanings towards spiritualism, and this may have comforted him when his servant left driven out by such manifestations as the phantom caught staring across the dining room, through the wall, and disappearing on the lawn. The nun, too, made more frequent appearances, often in daylight, when the gardener and the postman both mistook her for a visiting sister of mercy. All who saw her commented on her closed eyes and woebegone expression. In 1929, a new rector, Eric Smith, was sufficiently disturbed by the phenomena to contact the Daily Mirror, who sent a well-known writer on psychic matters, Harry Price, to investigate. The spirits could not have been more cooperative. Ghostly fingers tapped out messages on a looking glass. Vases shattered against the walls. Keys hurled themselves out of keyholes. And an invisible hand flung a candlestick at Price's head. Borley Rectory became front-page news. Please get help. All this proved too much for Mr. Smith, who resigned the living to the Rev. Lionel Foister and his young wife Marianne. Between 1930 and 1935, Mrs. Foister was the centre of new and somewhat pathetic manifestations. Penciled scribblings addressed to her appeared on the walls. Many were illegible, but others clearly implored Marianne for light mass candles and begged, please get help. Suspicion arose that Mrs. Foister was in some way responsible for the phenomenon. But this she indignantly denied. A séance was held, and for a while the hauntings practically ceased. In 1937, Harry Price revisited the now empty rectory and leased it for a year. He advertised for investigators, and out of an overwhelming response, selected 40, including the philosopher and late Professor C.E.M. Joad. Rooms were sealed, movable objects ringed with chalk, and thermometers to record the drop in temperature that traditionally announced a ghostly arrival were placed in every corridor. Once again, candlesticks hurled themselves about and brick poised themselves in mid-air to be photographed. Other séances were held at which Mary Lair identified herself, saying she had been strangled on May 17th, 1667, and had then been buried in the garden. Excavations proved disappointing, however, and at a further séance on March 27, 1938, another spirit interrupted to announce that the rectory would burn down that very night. The evening passed without incident, and in May, Price relinquished his lease to the new owner, a Captain Gregson. The captain did not enjoy his tenancy for long. The ghost was as active as ever. His dogs disappeared. And then on February 27th, 1939, exactly 11 months later than scheduled, a lamp toppled over, apparently of its own volition, and Borley Rectory burst into flames. But while the old house burnt furiously, several onlookers saw strange figures in the smoke, and silhouetted against a flame-lit window, the form of a nun. Ghostly writings, messages appeared on Borley walls beseeching the help of Marianne Foister, the rector's wife. This was one of the earliest scribbles. It says, Marianne. It's hard to read. She says, I cannot understand, tell me more. Can't make it out. The end of Borley Rectory. The most haunted house in England was destroyed by fire on February 27th, 1939, exactly 11 months after the date forecast by a spirit that called itself Sonex Amares. At the same séance, it announced that the fire would begin over the hall, which in fact it did. The blaze apparently began when a paraffin lamp dashed itself to the floor. While the house was burning, local people reported the cowled figure of a nun standing at an upstairs window, and several other weird shapes were seen among the flames. Even after the house was in ruins, the nun was said to walk about the upper rooms, though there were no floors left to support her. In 1943, the psychic investigator Harry Price reported finding the bones of a young woman free-fought beneath the cellar floor, and alleged that they were the remains of the strangled nun. The bones were given Christian burial, but even so, the nun is still occasionally glimpsed near the site of the rectory and in Borley churchyard. The Boggart's hauntings. The horrible shrieks of one kind of boggart, a class of supernatural creature particularly common in the northwest, have earned it the name shrieker, though it is also called a barghest or trash. Usually it appears as an omen of death, sometimes in the form of a white cow or horse, or as an enormous black or white dog with huge pads, shaggy hair, and glaring saucer-like eyes. Shriekers are rarely violent, though there are exceptions. In 1825, near Manchester Old Church, a tradesman called Drabble was attacked by an immense headless dog, which to his unspeakable terror ran him all the way home, with its front paws on his shoulders. Murders and the murdered. Some boggarts, especially human-shaped ones, are distinctly malicious. The boggart of the Brook, the awful caretaker of a bridge near Garstang, is allegedly the ghost of a murdered woman, and takes the form of a skeleton closely wrapped in a cloak and hood. She used to hitch lifts from horsemen at night, and only reveal her true identity when safely mounted behind them. With a diabolical cackle, she would whip the horse into a wild gallop and cling with her cold bony hands to the rider's back until, fainting with terror, he was thrown from the horse and injured or killed. The white dobby, on the other hand, lives in a world of its own, though it seems in some way attached to the coastal village of Furness. It appears like a wandering, weary, emaciated and silent human, and dresses in a dirty white topcoat. Its constant companion is a white hare with glaring, bloodshot eyes. Speculating about its origins, some people have suggested that it must be the ghost of a murderer, and the hare is the eternally vindictive spirit of one of his victims. Boggart flitting. There are many stories of benevolent boggarts helping farmers to thresh their corn and get in the harvest. In one story, the farmer used to reward his otherworldly assistant with a jug of cream, but when the farmer died and his son took over the farm, the new farmer's wife gave it skimmed milk instead. This so infuriated the boggart that it took to stealing chickens and hens, making the cream go sour and banging pots and kettles together all night long. At last the couple could stand it no longer. They packed all their belongings into a cart and set off at dawn to find a new home. At the edge of the village they met a neighbour who asked them in surprise if they were flitting. Before they had time to reply, a strange hollow voice rang out from inside a churn, on the cart behind them. I, neighbour, were flitting. The Headless Woman. The country lanes around Longridge in Lancashire were once haunted by a malicious boggart called the Headless Woman. From behind, she looked just like any other old lady, hobbling along in her fringed cape and old-fashioned coal-scuttle bonnet, and carrying a basket under one arm. At first, she would walk quietly beside any walkers who tried to overtake her, listening politely to their conversation, but suddenly, when they were least expecting it, she would turn to face them, revealing that inside her bonnet there was nothing, and as they recoiled in horror, she would whip the cloth off the top of her basket, and out would spring her head, shrieking with laughter and snapping viciously. Her head had a mobility of its own. It would pursue unfortunate travellers for miles, bounding along the road behind them. A local man once met the Headless Woman after a hard night's drinking at Longridge. He had set out on the lonely walk home across the fells when she attacked him. Luckily, he was a fast runner, and jumping over the snapping head, he fled to the safety of his home. His wife's reaction was unsympathetic, to say the least. "If it makes me fain of my own hearthstone," she said, "I'se be some glad on it, for it's more nor a woman wi' a heed on her shoulders hae been able to do." Heck Speckle's Phantom. Selkirk. There was once a suitor or shoemaker in Selkirk named Rabbi Hecklespeckle. Rabbi was very industrious and used to be at his bench long before dawn. Early one morning, a stranger came into the shop. He wore a long black cloak and a big hat pulled down over his eyes. The stranger picked up one of the shoes on the bench and tried it on. Finding it a perfect fit, he paid Rabbi in gold and promised to return for the other shoe before cockcrow the following day. Thinking it over, Rabbi became suspicious of his customer. His clothes smelt uncommonly mouldy, and Rabbi had the impression too that his purse had contained as many worms and beetles as gold pieces. But true to his word, the stranger returned next morning and paid for the other shoe. This time, however, Rabbi followed him. The tall, cloaked figure walked across the churchyard to a grave, jumped into it, and disappeared. Later that day, Rabbi and a few neighbours returned and dug up the corpse. Sure enough, it was wearing the new shoes, which the suitor at once reclaimed. Early next morning, as usual, Rabbi's wife heard him singing and banging away at his work. Suddenly, his song ended in a screech. She rushed in, but her husband had vanished. When the grave was reopened, the corpse was once more wearing its new shoes, and clutched in its right hand was Rabbi Hecklespeckle's nightcap. But Rabbi himself had gone forever. The tasks and torments of Jan Tregeagle. It may be that the dark spirit that is said to wander Bodmin's moor, loneliest places, and whose despairing cries can still be heard above the autumn gales between Land's End and the Lizard, is no more than a distant memory of some ancient Celtic god. But from the mid-17th century at least, the Cornish have identified this spectre with the soul of Jan Tregeagle, doomed to eternal torment for the sins he committed in life. Whether he really sold his soul to the devil or committed the crimes ascribed to him is not known. Despite folk tales that he murdered his wife and children and seized an orphan's estates, there is little doubt that John Tregeagle really existed. In the early 1600s, he was a stern and unpopular local magistrate who used his position to amass a considerable fortune. Part of this, it is said, was expended in bribes to the clergy, so that, despite his evil ways, he could be buried in the consecrated ground of St. Breock's churchyard. Legend says this precaution availed him little. Within a few short years, he was to be beckoned from the grave itself. Called from the grave. There are several versions of the way in which Tregeagle was called from the grave. One legend tells how a dispute arose between two families over the ownership of some land near Bodmin. The case had been confused by the conduct of Tregeagle, who, while alive, had acted as lawyer to one of the claimants. Tregeagle, by fraud, had made it appear that he himself held title to the land in question. At the Assize Court, just as the judge was about to sum up, the defendant asked to call a further witness. The atmosphere in the court chilled. Suddenly, Tregeagle's phantom appeared in the witness box. The judge's determined self-possession overcame the courtroom's panic, and the cross-examination began. Tregeagle revealed that the honest defendant had been a victim of his fraud, and the jury gave their unanimous verdict in the man's favour. However, Tregeagle's spirit was still present in the courtroom. The judge commanded that the defendant should remove his witness, but the man replied that to bring Tregeagle from his grave had been such a dreadful task that he preferred to leave the phantom in the care of the court, and with this he walked out of the building. The local clergy were then called. They felt it was their duty to save Tregeagle's soul if they could, so they decided to set him a task that would gauge him for all eternity. So long as he toiled at it, he would be safe from the evil one. Emptying a bottomless pool. Bound by spells, Tregeagle was given a perforated limpet shell and assigned to empty Dosemary Pool, a supposedly bottomless lake on Bodmin Moor. He was kept to his work by a pack of headless demon hounds, waiting to carry him off once he ceased his labours. One night, terrified by a raging storm, Tregeagle defied even the demons and fled across Bodmin Moor, the evil pack in hot pursuit. At last he reached the chapel of Roche Rock. Thrusting his head through the east window, he attempted to gain the sanctuary of the church, but while his head was within the chapel, his body remained outside, exposed to the storm and the fury of the hounds of hell. Weaving ropes from sand, his screams were heard for miles, and after a few days the priest of the rock could stand the situation no longer. Calling upon the aid of two saints, he led Tregeagle to Padstow Beach, where he was set to weave ropes from sand. Whenever the tide swept in, his efforts were ruined, and his howls of disappointment allowed little rest to the local people. Padstow's patron saint, St. Petrock, decided to move Tregeagle on. The saint forged a chain with his own hands, and with this he bound the phantom and drove it to Burepper near Helston. There Tregeagle was commanded to carry sacks of sand across the estuary of the Law and empty them at Porthleven, continuing until Burepper Beach was a swept expanse of rock. But his labour was in vain. The tide swept the sand back as fast as Tregeagle could move it. Eventually, a spiteful demon tripped him while he was crossing the estuary. He he dropped the sack from his arms and spilt the sand. The ridge it formed has sealed off the harbour and is known today as Lobar. The angry Helston people shackled him once more and sent him to Land's End. Here he was set the task of sweeping the sand from Port Curno Cove into Mill Bay. Tregeagle still labours, it is said, battling with the Atlantic currents to complete his impossible task. His howls of rage can be heard when gales throw the sand back on the beach. Tregeagle's Ghost and the Debtor. Another version of the story describing his summoning from the grave tells of a man who lent another a large sum of money, the transaction being witnessed by Tregeagle just before he died. When the moneylender demanded settlement, the debtor denied all knowledge of the deal. In Bodmin Court, certain of the safety, the defendant exclaimed, "If Tregeagle ever saw it, I wish to God he would come and declare it." In a clap of thunder, Tregeagle's ghost appeared and promised the terrified man, "I will not be such an easy task to get rid of me as it has been to call me." The debtor settled his account and sought to rid himself of Tregeagle with the aid of wise men and parsons. They succeeded in binding him for a while to the task of emptying Dawsbury Pool with a leaking limpet shell. In this version, Tregeagle completed the job and returned to torment the debtor, who then procured the assistance of a powerful exorcist. Restrained by the exorcist, Tregeagle allowed himself to be led to Gwenver Cove. There he was set to weaving a rope of sand, which when finished he was to carry to Carnolva. Tregeagle was unable to accomplish his work until one frosty night he poured water from a nearby brook onto the rope. Ice cemented it together, and the ghost carried it in triumph to Carnolva. At once he flew back to his wretched prey, intent on tearing him to pieces. But the man was holding a child whose aura of innocence could not be penetrated by the evil. Again the priests were called, and once more they bound Tregeagle to weaving ropes of sand at Gwenver. But this time he was forbidden to approach the water. Beaten at last, Tregeagle remains in continuous struggle. When a northerly wind destroys his work, his roars can still be heard across White Sand Bay. The Ghost of Sawston Hall. Among the ghosts reputed to haunt 16th century Sawston Hall in Cambridgeshire is the figure of Queen Mary Tudor, which has been seen both gliding serenely through the house and flitting at great speed through the gardens. Another spectre, known as the Lady in Grey, appears at the tapestry room. It is said to knock 3 times at the door and then float across the room. An undergraduate and a clairvoyant are among the people who have stayed overnight in the room and declared next morning that their sleep had been disturbed by repeated rapping at the door and the sound of someone fiddling with the latch. A strange tapping also kept a priest awake in his bedroom nearby. Other inexplicable sounds which have been heard in the house include the distant music of a spinet and the trill of a girl's laughter. Refuge for a Queen. On the night of July 7th, 1553, Mary Tudor took refuge in Sawston Hall from the treacherous Duke of Northumberland, who was plotting to imprison her. At dawn, a party of Northumberland's men was seen approaching the house and Mary was forced to flee disguised as a milkmaid. Balked for their victim, the pursuers burnt down the house. When Mary became queen, she rewarded the Huddlestons to whom the house belonged by rebuilding it. To this day, her portrait hangs in the Great Hall, and her ghost is said to haunt the house and gardens. The tradition that Mary slept in the tapestry room is almost certainly untrue, though the four-poster may have survived the fire. But what is certain, according to those who have stayed there, is that it is impossible to spend the night in Mary's room without being disturbed by phantoms. The most haunted house in Scotland. Somewhere in the 15-foot thick walls of Glamis Castle in Angus, the birthplace of Princess Margaret and the ancestral home of the Earls of Strathmore, there may be a bricked-up secret chamber that conceals the earthly remains of a hideous monster. For by tradition, a monstrous child was born into the family some 200 years ago and was secretly incarcerated in the castle walls. As each heir to the earldom reached the age of 21, he was told the awful secret and shown the rightful earl, an immensely strong and long-lived beast. It is rumoured, which had no neck, tiny arms and legs, and a huge, hairy, barrel-like body. It is said that it lived until the 1920s. Apart from its legendary monster, Glamis Castle has at least 9 ghosts, which probably make it the most haunted house in Scotland. One is said to be Macbeth, endlessly expiating the murder of King Duncan. Another is Earl Beardy, who plays dice with the devil for the sin of gambling on Sunday. An unidentified grey lady haunts the chapel, and a tongueless woman races across the grounds, tearing frantically at her mouth. And on wild winter nights, a ghostly madman has been reported walking the roof along the Mad Earl's Walk. Ghosts with a mission. In many cases, the reasons for the most persistent British hauntings have been long forgotten. Anonymous grey ladies and brown ladies walk the corridors of their old homes, apparently unaware of living witnesses and of their effect upon them. It has been suggested that such apparitions may be the result of emotions so intense that in some way we do not yet understand, they have left a visible imprint upon the atmosphere. These are not ghosts in the accepted sense, but rather manifestations of ancient loves, hopes, or fears, which some people are sensitive enough to intercept and see as phantoms. The eerie gift is said to be the reason why one person in a group may be terrified by a ghost, while his companions see nothing at all. On the other hand, there are a large number of stories of people who have returned from the grave in order to right a wrong or to complete some important task left unfinished. In a trial at Durham in 1631, 2 men named Sharp and Walker were accused of murdering a girl called Anne, a young relation of Walker. The case for the prosecution rested on the testimony of James Graham, a miller, who claimed to have been accosted late one night by the blood-drenched ghost of a young woman, hideously disfigured by 5 open wounds on her head. She told him that her name was Anne Walker, that Mark Sharp had murdered her with a pickaxe, and that her corpse lay in the coal pit on the moor. She added that Sharp had been acting on orders from Walker, by whom she was pregnant. Anne's ghost ordered the terrified miller to relay this information to the local magistrate, and threatened that she would haunt him until he did. At first, disbelieving the evidence of his eyes, Graham held back, but after the ghost had appeared to him twice more, he could bear the haunting no longer, and told his story to the local magistrate. Anne Walker's corpse was discovered in the pit, which her ghost had described. The two alleged murderers were arrested, tried and hanged. And Graham was never troubled by the ghost again. The Screaming Skulls. With grisly nostalgia, some ghosts stubbornly cling to their mortal remains on earth. There are several country houses, including Betty's Come House in Dorset and Burton Agnes Hall in Yorkshire, which list the skull of a former occupant amongst their furnishings. If such skulls are removed, or if any attempt is made to bury them, then hideous screams ring through the house, and dire misfortune falls upon the occupants. Understandably, the matter is seldom put to the test. Even after death, some people are able to maintain a surprisingly physical existence. There is, for instance, the story of an artillery colonel who in 1943 walked into the billiard room of his new mess in the Midlands to find that the table was already being used by an officer. The colonel challenge to a game was accepted, but halfway through the match, the gong sounded for dinner, and his opponent put up his cue and walked out. Over dinner, the colonel asked about the strange officer and was surprised to learn that no one else had met him. It was then that the butler, who had been kept on as a mess servant when the house was commandeered, broke in to explain that the colonel's opponent was almost certainly the ghost of a former heir to the property. He had joined Kitchener's army in 1915, but was invalidated out for a long-standing illness he had tried to conceal. Christmas 1916, he returned to his home, full of a bitter sense of failure, shot himself in the billiard room.